Hi, welcome to Anna Pickle Knitting. This is a Drawstring Project Bag tutorial today instead of the regular podcast. I would like to show you how to make a simple small project bag, ideal for socks or another single skein project. And this project bag is going to have just a couple of really simple options. And the first is that you do not need to put a handle at all. Remembering that drawstring bags, when you draw the string up, you end up with one or two loops, depending on how you made it, with which you can carry your bag. So this is not necessary, so you can choose to not put a handle on at all, as I did with this one, no handle, or you can choose to put a handle. The other options have to do with the drawstring, so really, pretty simple options. My favorite is to use Grosgrain ribbon and to do two, so that when you pull it together, again, you have a handle, so you don't have to make a handle on your bag. You can also use a self fabric to make your own drawstring. This would be the least expensive. However, you cannot make it from the yardage that I tell you about. If you want to do this, you're going to need another 2 inches of probably not the entire width of the fabric, but quite a bit of it, or about 36 inches, so a yard if you were going the lengthwise. So if you have extra fabric from something that'll match your bag, maybe a scrap fabric that'll match, then this is an inexpensive alternative. Another alternative is to use a cording. This type cording here I got at Joann Fabrics. So that's another way. This is a different type of cording that you can use, and this one is a Recollections product, which is Michael's. So that was from Michael's Craft Store. And I showed you self fabric and Grosgrain ribbon, so other types of ribbon. And another thing you could use, if you could get colors to match and the right length, are shoelaces. They have that little thing at the end, so that makes it nice to thread through. Your other option is you can do two. If you do 2 cords, then that pulls together one way. Or if you use 1 cord, you can also use one of these cord stoppers. And I didn't get this one, but I did get 2 different kinds at Michael's. So when you pull the drawstring, it locks up here at the top. So that's a cord lock. So that's, and in this case, I used twill. And this twill tape was available. I did purchase this at Joann's. So that makes a nice handle too. And if you tied those together, you could use that as a handle instead of the other handle. Now with your handles, you can make an attached handle, which is much simpler, and then you don't need hardware. Or you can make the detachable handle, in which case you're going to need a D-ring and a lobster clasp with a D-ring on it, however you want to do it. So let's talk about some of the materials that you'll need. And I have my list here so that I don't forget anything or misstate. This project bag can be made from 3 quilting fat quarters. And I am going to show you a layout in a minute on 3 fat quarters. The thing to remember about a fat quarter is the way that they are cut is not always the same depending on where you purchase them. So when I show you the layout, I did use 3 fat quarters with directional prints upside down. But so that's a directional print. It needs to go this way. If I put it this way, I'm going to have, kind of strangely jumping reindeer. So this is the 22-inch part, the width. And if your design goes that way, this will work. And if it doesn't have a direction print, it won't matter. But if your fabric was cut this way, this is a directional print. Obviously, we want our birds going side to side. But this is the 18-inch part of this fat quarter, and the 22-inch runs lengthwise, which is a little bit more unusual to be cut this way, but I did purchase it cut this way. If you do have a print that is this way, it is not going to work the way I show you, but it can still work. It's just that the piece that you cut from here is your main fabric piece. This is what I call the main fabric piece. And this is the width of the fabric. There's only a seam on one side. This side is not seamed. You would have to seam it there, so you would cut two pieces. You would have to take half of the pattern, the 20.5 inches, and add a seam allowance to half of it, and add a seam allowance to a second half, and cut them out going with the length, and then piece them. So it can still be done, but just be careful before you start. And my preference would be to not have to seam it. But of course, if that's all you have to go with, and you can still do it, it's just going to be, you're going to be a little bit more creative. So 3 fat quarters. Now, a lot of my bags have canvas at the bottom. And when I put canvas at the bottom, I've never seen canvas available in a fat quarter. But so I bought more, but you can cut it from 1/4 yard, so that would be 9 inches. Up by the width of the fabric, and you actually could get at least two out of your yardage depending on the width of the fabric. But you'll still want to buy 1/4 yard. It's just that you're not probably going to want to use this for your handle, so you could omit the handle, but you don't want to use it for your casing. In that case, from the casing, you could use your main fabric, or you could use as I did here, I used my lining fabric for the casing, and I used my main fabric for the handle. And I had enough fabric from 2 fat quarters and this 1/4 yard of canvas. And canvas makes a nice bottom. The colors are less available, at least at my Joann Fabrics, but I did find all of the canvas that I've used in my bags, I'll be showing you, are canvas from Joann Fabrics. So I'm saying that because that's the only large big box kind of chain fabric store that I have available, and I know that they are available in lots of places. So your local fabric store that probably carries a large variety of fabrics is going to have some kind of canvas. If you'd like to do a canvas bottom, which is sturdy, and the solids go nicely if you can find a matching color. So that's to do with our fabrics. You're also going to need some interfacing, and I'm going to show you part of the packaging from the interfacing I used. It is a lightweight, woven, fusible interfacing. You do not need to use this brand, and if you don't mind the non-woven, you can try that too. It's not my preference, so you could try it. I don't know how it will work for you, but the woven works really nicely. So if that's available, you can buy it in packages or by the yard. It's sold in 20-inch wide pieces. And it's not the cheapest interfacing available, but you only need 15 inches. So if you bought a 1/2 yard, you're going to have quite a bit left over. You can have a little left over if you have them just do 15 inches. I don't like to call it that close because sometimes those cuts are crooked or wobbly, and then you might run a little bit short. The next thing you're going to need is one piece of the Fusible Fleece or Fusible batting. And you want this to be the low-loft. This is I'm showing you a picture here of the brand that I used. It does not need to be this brand, but this is what I used. And you're only going to need 11 inches. So if you buy 1/2 yard, or if they'll let you buy 11, or maybe you'd want to go with 12 inches just to be sure you don't have wobbly cuts, you're going to be cutting one piece 10 1/4 inches. So you've got to have more than that, and then 20.5 inches, or 20 inches wide for the interfacing. So you're going to have another piece left over. So if you bought a yard of the interfacing and a 1/2 yard of the fusible, you could get 2 bags out of that. Of course, you're going to need some thread and something to use for your drawstring. As I mentioned, it could be grosgrain ribbon, it could be cording, it could be twill tape, or you can make one if you have a long enough piece of fabric. I wouldn't want to piece that self-cording because the self-fabric drawstring, because pulling it through is just a little bit tight, and with having a seam in it, that might make it too tough. You could certainly try it, but I really wouldn't want to. If you want one of those little cord locks, those are available at Joann's. I'm showing you here some made by Dritz that I purchased at my local Joann's. I did not have color availability of either of these styles, but there was a third style where a clear one was available. If you want the detachable handle, you're going to need a D-ring and that lobster clasp that has a D-ring on the end of it. And these are available at Joann's, but not the type that I used. I had purchased these in bulk through Amazon, and I think I had to buy at least 50. You also might choose to embellish your bag, and so the embellishments of your choice would be included as a material that you need. Now, as for equipment and tools that you'll need, of course you need your sewing machine, and you have to have an iron and either some sort of pressing surface or your ironing board. I do use spray starch when I am getting my pieces ready. It just makes it easier for me to control them, so perhaps you want to use some spray starch. And you'll need some pins and or clips. I use both as I'm piecing things together. And you will also need a medium to large size safety pin, and that's so that we can thread our drawstring through that casing at the top of the bag. So those are the materials that you'll need and your tools. And so now I would like to just show you the layout of the fabric as I did it on 3 different directional prints, just to show you that it can be done. Keeping in mind, if you're using canvas, you're going to be using another piece of fabric or your fat quarters. You can do it with the canvas and 2 fat quarters, but there's going to be a little adjustment there. So first let me show you on the main color, and this is the top of your bag and also the inside pocket, although the pocket can be cut from one of the other fabrics if you have space. So I would suggest cutting piece A, piece B, and piece C first, placing those, and then you can decide what remaining fabric you have, and maybe you'd like to change the arrangement of the fabrics. So this piece is going to be, as you can see, 7 inches tall and 20.5 inches wide. That's the maximum width that I tried, because you always want to cut off the salvage edge of your fat quarter, and that was probably included as part of the measurement, and that's unusable fabric. So you're going to want to cut that off, and because sometimes they're cut a little bit differently, I didn't want to give you a larger piece than that. The contrast color, which is going to be the bottom of your bag, and from this you need a piece 5 inches tall and 20.5 inches wide. And then you need from color C to cut your lining, which is going to be, of course, the inside of your bag, but it also can be the casings and the handle from the lining, or maybe you want to do the casings and the handle from your contrast color. That's your choice. For the pocket, you need a piece that is 8 inches tall by 6 inches wide. If you have a non-directional print, it doesn't matter which direction that you place it. You'll notice when I did, and I'll show it again, my main color, I placed the pocket at the top, and then I placed my main fabric under it. And that's because I was trying to center a bit of that reindeer on my pocket, and also make sure that a full part of the reindeer were showing on the front and the back of my bag. So you can play around with your placement. With the casings, you're going to cut one piece that's 5 inches tall by 10 inches wide. However, if you used canvas and so you're trying to squeeze your pieces out of the main color and the lining, you might need to take that piece, and instead of cutting one piece 5 inches tall by 10 inches wide, cut 2 pieces that are 2.5 inches tall by 10 inches wide, and that will fit on the available fabric. Just make sure that you play around with cutting your A, B, and C first, and then playing around with how you place those pieces. For a detachable handle, if you decide you want a detachable handle, you're going to need to cut a piece 3 1/4 inches wide by 18 inches long. If you'd like to attach your handle and eliminate the hardware, you're going to need to cut it 3 1/4 inches wide by 15 inches long. And that will give you, if you only did 14 inches, probably work just as fine. From your interfacings, because they're 20 inches wide, you're going to carefully place them on there. You're going to cut a piece 10¼ inches tall by 20 inches wide. And on the pattern, the piece directions, I call that a scant piece, meaning that go in about 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch just to make it a teeny bit smaller than the measurements, or that gives you some space to play if your 20-inch wide piece is not quite there. It can be a little bit smaller is what I'm saying. You also need to cut a piece of interfacing to go in that handle, and that it needs to be 5/8 of an inch wide by 14 inches long. And if you're not doing a handle, you can forget that. And then for the pocket, if you cut your pocket 6 by 8, you're going to want to cut your interfacing 5½ inches wide by 3¾ inches tall. And that is because it only goes in half the pocket. You could, if you have available fabric and want a larger pocket, save that for your last thing you're cutting, and then you're going to adjust your interfacing so that you have, it's only half the pocket and that it's 1/4 inch left around the 3 sides that aren't going to be on the fold. For your fleece, you're going to need it 10¼ inches tall by 20 inches wide. And your drawstring, if you're purchasing for drawstring, if you're going to put just one drawstring, and maybe you're going to use maybe you're going to tie a knot, so you're going to have open ends, or maybe you're going to use one of those cord stops, you're going to want about 36 inches long. And for 2 tied cords, such as this bag, where I tied one cord going this way and one going this way, and then they're tied, you're going to need 2 pieces that are approximately 30 inches long. I say that because for me, I need to tie that knot, and I'd rather have leftover and then snip it off evenly than try and finagle a knot that where I don't have enough cord to deal with. So that is what we need to cut for our bag and the materials that we'll need. At this point, I think we're ready to prepare our fabrics and get started sewing. So that will be the next segment here. After cutting your fabric and your interfacing and fusible fleece pieces, the first step is to take your main fabric piece here and your contrast fabric, turn them right sides together, making sure that if you have a directional print that is going to matter, that it the top is up here. This is going to be the bottom of your directional print, and we're going to stitch a 3/8 inch seam allowance along here and then press it open. After sewing your seam and pressing the seam allowance open, we want to get our fusible lightweight interfacing and place it with the sticky side, which is usually the rough side, towards the wrong side of the fabric, and we want to center it so that we're leaving most of our future 4 seam allowances without very much of this poking into those seams. It's okay if a little bit goes in there, if it's not, you know, perfectly the 3/8 inch around, but we would like to keep this minimized. So we're going to attach it with your manufacturer's directions. In my case, it's just light pressing. The next piece we're going to work on is going to be the casing for our drawstring at the top of the bag. Now, depending on which pieces of fabric you chose to make this part of the bag, you might need to cut this already into 2 pieces. So that would be cutting it 10 inches by 2½ and you would need 2 of those. Or the easier method is, if you have the space on your fabric, is to cut it 10 inches long by 5 inches wide. In either case, our ends need to be folded over twice. So we're going to fold under and press about 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit less, and then we're going to turn that a second time and press it. Using the right side of the fabric, we're then going to stitch that folded part down on both sides. If you've had to cut it this way, then you'll just need to do that 4 times instead of twice. And when we come back, I'll show you what to do next. I am doing my piece as the 10 by 5 inch piece, and at this point we're now going to cut it in half lengthwise, making each part 2½ inches wide. So if you had cut 2 pieces, you will already have that and not need to do that. I think it's easier to get the same size pieces if you do it as one and then cut it apart, but it really doesn't matter if the fabric you have is narrower, then do it this way. So these are going to be our drawstring casings. We're going to go to the ironing board now and fold them in half this way and make a nice press. Now we're going to figure out where to place those casings on our front fabric that we have created. And we all cut a slight bit differently, and we all, sometimes we will get our fabric to stretch while we're pressing it. So rather than give you an exact place to put these with a measurement, because that could then be off, I would like for you to take your your main fabric piece here that you've already pieced and fold it in half as it's going to be, so wrong sides together. And we want to get the halfway marking right over here in this corner at the top, so where it's been folded. So I did a little finger press there. I'm going to open this piece up, and in the top seam allowance part, I'm going to make a little mark. The next thing I need to do is to measure 3/8 of an inch in on this side of the bag and place a little mark, and then do the same thing on the other edge. And that tells me what is going to be my area that's going to be useful in the front. So there's my mark for the seam allowance, and I have a mark here in the middle. Hopefully you can see that. And then we have our other side. So using this then as my measurement, I'm going to measure how far this is. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That is what you should have. But, you know, so, as I said, sometimes we stretch our fabric a little bit and we don't want to, but it happens. So I'm going to flip this to the front, and I will be using those marks from the back to center this between those 10 inches. I found on my bag that if I am 1/2 inch from the fold here and 1/2 inch from the mark that I put, the seam allowance mark, and I've transferred this to the front so you can see it a little bit better. I can see it through the fabric, but you might not be able to. So between here and here, if I center my casing, I find that 1/2 inch on either side is the same, it centers it. So you want to then pin this into place. So we're not centering it based on the edge of the fabric. Pin it in place, and then you're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to press this down within the seam allowance. So about 1/4 inch from the edge, if you'll do this stitching to keep it into place, that won't show when we're finishing the bag. The casings have now been pressed down, and we're going to set this piece aside and work on the interior pocket next. You can make your pocket any size that you have fabric for or would like to have it, or you can totally omit the pocket. I've done 6 by 8, and I'm going to be folding it so that I still have 6 in width, but now I would have 4 inches for my length. And you need to press it so that you can see where the fold is, and put your interfacing piece down, and we'll press the interfacing piece down, and then we're going to actually, while we're at the ironing board, go ahead and turn it and press it again outside so that we can sew the pocket. Okay, my interfacing has been pressed, and I have turned it in, so that right sides are together, and pressed it again to keep it in place. I want to show you, I've drawn some lines here where we're going to be sewing. I'm using 1/4 inch seam allowance on the pocket. You can use it, depends on your size pocket, it doesn't matter, whatever you want. But you'll notice that I only came to about here, maybe 1 inch, 1.5 inches in from both sides. So we're going to leave this as an opening so that we can turn the pocket inside out. So you'll sew your seams here, and you can trim the corners off of these 4 corners before you flip it inside out. We've now sewn around our pocket, leaving an opening. But what I've done when I afterwards is folded the seam allowance towards the inside on the front and the back and pressed it down. That way I know that I have a nice straight line across the bottom. We're not going to stitch that up. We're just going to use, when we attach it to the lining fabric, we're just going to use the stitching along here to hold that fabric inside. So we can flip the pocket inside out, give it another press after you get the corners poked out, and set this aside for now. If you are making the bag that has a detachable handle where you have a D-ring attached to your bag and this lobster clasp attached to your handle, you will follow these directions. You will have the 18-inch long piece of fabric that's about 3 1/4 inches wide. If you are doing a handle that is just sewn into the side of the bag, your piece is going to be 3 inches shorter, and you are not going to be putting it together quite the same way, but you will be doing this first step the same way, other than your piece being shorter. What we want to do at the ironing board is to fold this first in half and give it a really good press, and then open it and fold both raw edges towards the center, towards that fold that you just pressed in. Give that a good press, and then fold it over and press it again, so you end up with a piece that's about 5/8 of an inch wide, maybe 3/4 of an inch wide, about like that. Okay, so and then you're going to come back and open the entire piece up. So I'll see you back when you've done that press. So now you've done your pressing, and we are going to open this handle back up and put our fusible interfacing about 1/2 inch from one of the ends, and in one of the two inside pieces. It doesn't matter which side you put this on, but you want to lay it out like this, and you'll see it does not go all the way to the end. That's what we want, and you'll need to go back and press it. Now you can close it up to press it right through here, and it'll do a fine job. I've fused my interfacing down, and now I'm going to remove 3 inches from this, the end that does not have interfacing. I'm going to trim 3 inches off of that. This piece is going to be used to attach the D-ring to the bag, and this piece will become our handle. So now we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to be doing 2 different things. Now if you have a handle that's going to be just sewn into the side of your bag, you're going to do exactly what we're going to do with this piece that doesn't have the interfacing, although you will have it. You could leave it out if you don't want it that way. You want to leave it closed up, and we need to stitch less than 1/8 of an inch, or about 1/8 of an inch maybe, from either edge, or both edges I should say, so that we enclose the raw edges inside. So we're going to, if you're doing just an attached handle, do it this way, but if you're doing a detachable one with the D-ring, do the same thing with this piece. With this piece, if you have a detachable handle, you need to put your lobster clasp on the handle before you do anything else. I have frequently forgotten that step, and then you have to take it all out. So you want to first do this, and then you need to open both ends of your handle, and making sure that you haven't twisted it. Pin the ends together so you match up that line that you pressed in the center, and then you should have one on either side. You want to pin these down so that you're getting a nice straight seam across here. And you're going to sew a 3/8 inch seam right across through both pieces that are right sides together, and then open it up. I usually will take a sleeve board and lay it over here after I've sewn it and press that seam open. That needs to be an open seam. So let's go and sew this part if you're doing this handle, and this part for the D-ring, or if your entire handle, is 15 inches long like this, sew both sides. All right, this little piece has been sewn, and I'm going to fold it in half and put the D-ring through there. And I will go back to the machine and just stitch it together in this area. Here is my detachable handle where I've pressed that seam allowance open, and you're now going to close it back up. Sometimes it needs to be pressed right in there again, depending on how much of the pressing your iron just took out. Fold it back together so that you do have a smooth handle, and the little D-ring and lobster clasp here are going to just slide around as you're sewing. And you're going to do the same thing to both sides that you did to this, the little 1/8 inch seam allowance on both sides. So let's do that now. So both sides have been sewn down, and I use the seam that we put it together as where we're going to fold it. That's going to be the very top where the D-ring is going to go. So I have pressed it down pretty hard there, and we're going to pull well, there's a D-ring here on your lobster clasp, so we're pulling that to the very top, and we are going to do a line of stitching about 1 inch in, just to keep the D-ring at the top of the handle and that we've separated the bottom of the handle. I'm also going to be putting a tag on my bag, and I like it on the handle. So before I stitch that down, I'm going to do a little zigzag stitch on either side of my little tag here, and then I will do that. So be right back. All right, we have finished our handle, and the D-ring is now securely stuck at the top of the handle, and we can set this aside. But we do need to, I haven't sewn mine together here. That needs to be sewn. I'm going to sew that together and get out my main fabric piece again for some placement. And I'm going to put a little clip there, and I'm going to stitch it down within the seam allowance. So we're going to have a 3/8 inch seam allowance here. I want to put it about 1/4 inch. That's just to hold it in place. I usually do some back stitching there because this is a heavy piece, but it's just holding it in place, and so we don't forget to put it in before we sew up our side seams. Okay, I have now stitched this piece down, and we're going to set this part of the bag aside unless you happen to be wanting to do a little embellishment. I had put this little metal tag. These tags are sold in Michael's or other crafting supply places in the scrapbook section. They're made by Tim Holtz, and they come with a variety. I think the package usually has 10 or 12 with little different sayings on them. So if I want to put one of these on my bag, this is the front of the bag. The left side of your bag is the front of the bag. And we do have some side parts, from the middle. So you want to place this so that it's somewhat in. You might want it down here on the contrast fabric, or you might want it up on the bag. I have it on the contrast on the other one. I'm going to put it down here. And I use this Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape to hold it in place so that it doesn't shift around and go crooked on me while I'm trying to sew it down. I do use a zigzag stitch on the machine to sew it down. So you don't have to use this. It's optional supply, but I find it very helpful. So I will just take off a little piece, maybe 1.5 inches long, decide where I want this to be, and apply it to the back of this embellishment. Now you could embellish with buttons, and if I was doing buttons that I was going to sew on with the machine, I would use the same thing, use some Wonder Tape underneath it. You do not have to embellish your bag by any means, but if you want to put something, now's the time. You don't want to do this after you've sewn your bag together. So I'm going to place that right there, and I will go do a little zigzag stitch and come back and show you. I've used the zigzag stitch here to attach this little tag onto the bag, and you could hand sew it on instead if you wanted to do something like that. You want to have your lining piece of fabric out now, and I have it with the right side down, and I'm going to place my top piece on top of this. So I want to make sure that they are both still the same size. Sometimes we do get as I said, with the pressing, some of our pieces stretch. And so I line it up this way, and then I'll flip it over and see how much, is there anything sticking out. And I do have a few little pieces here that I am going to just trim away. Really, I wouldn't have to on this, but you'll see there's a little bit there. I want to make sure everything is square and that they are both the same size pieces before I move forward. Okay, I'm happier now that things are squared up a little bit more, so we're going to set our main fabric aside, and we're going to take out our piece of fusible fiber fill. And we want to center that on the wrong side of our lining fabric, making sure that this rough side, which is the glue, is down so that we can adhere these two together. You'll notice that I have space all the way around, which I don't want to have this making my seam allowances too heavy. So I'm going to go over to the ironing board and press this down, and I will be back. We're now going to attach the pocket to the lining fabric, and you do not have to use the same fabric. I don't have enough of the main fabric to make my pocket out of the main fabric, which is what I would usually do. But we have attached our fiber fill by fusing it with the iron. We're going to center our pocket here, and in order to do that, you want to fold your lining piece like this again and finger press that fold mark, which is what we did with the main piece. And I've put a little mark where the fold is, and I've also put a marking here at 3/8 of an inch. I want to lay my pocket down, making sure that that open side is at the bottom, that open seam that we are going to close up as we attach it, but that's at the bottom. We would not want that at the top. And I put my pocket down about 2 inches. I try to center it just by eyeballing it as best I can, but then I'm going to use my ruler here that I can set and keep moving it. You'll see here this green mark is at my 3/8 inch. This is at the pocket, and over here the green part is at the fold line there, and my pocket is lined up. So my pocket is centered, and I just play around with it back and forth until I get the same distance from these two marks. Going to pin it down. I usually use about 3 pins, but I keep them away from the edge so I don't have to move them while I'm sewing. I'm not going to be sewing at the top at all. And I am going to sew all the way around the 3 sides, and I'm going to keep about 1/8 of an inch from the side. I have a little mark with my presser foot that's right where I keep it, and it's roughly 1/8 of an inch. But you know, you can put it however you'd like to have it. Do back stitch at the beginning and the end on both sides, because that'll be the stress point for the pocket. So let's go stitch our pocket down and then press it. All right, our pocket is attached inside our bag, and of course if you wanted a second pocket or to put something on this side, some kind of a crochet hook pocket, you could do anything inside the bag you wanted. You just want to do it now before we are actually going to assemble the bag, and that we've finally reached that point. I always think of all of this as the prep work. So we've prepped all of our pieces, and we are now going to stitch the bag together. So I have my lining with the right side facing up, and I'm going to take my main piece of fabric, or the front of the bag, and I'm going to place it face down. Now make sure that you have your top of your bag up near the top of the pocket, and that our contrast is down here near what's going to be the bottom of the bag. So we're going to do 1 line of stitching across the top of the bag. So I'm going to clip it together. Again, my right sides are together, and I'm going to clip across here. And please do make sure that your casings are facing down and not folded up into what's going to be our seam allowance. That would require some stitch picking. And we're going to do a 3/8 inch seam allowance across what is the top of the bag. So I'll see you back here. Also, press that seam open once you have sewn it together. All right, we've sewn those that one seam together, and I've pressed it open. We are now going to turn to the right side, and we're going to fold it the opposite direction, where we are seeing that the two seams, the two edges of these seams that we just made, we are going to pin together. And match them up so that you have a nice matched bag there. And the next spot that we're going to match is where our contrast and main fabrics come together. So we're going to make sure that that seam is lined up straight like that and pin both sides of it. And we're going to pin the bottom of the bag. Now, I have to use two different colors of thread on my bag, so I'm going to be using the taupe on this side and the blue on this side. So I'm going to start my stitching right here in the center, and I'm going to stitch a 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way down to this corner, and then I'm going to come from here and stitch all the way across here. And I will come back then, and if you can just use one color, you'll just do this all as one step. But I'm going to do this part first. So if you can just use one color thread, just keep, this will have been pinned here. And we're going to be on the lining side, remembering that we need an opening with which to turn our bag. So I usually come down a little over an inch from the center seam here, and I'm going to stitch to at least that point. At the bottom, I'm going to be cutting away for my boxed corners. So I need to remember, I'm just going to think to myself about 2 inches in for sure, and about another inch will give us some space that we do have a seam over here. We're going to leave this part open. Now for me, I sometimes forget that I'm leaving it open, so I put a number of these clips here that are just my personal way of remembering, stop stitching here at the pen and don't stitch in this area. But we will pin around the corner. So what happens with this bag is that we are stitching almost as we did on the pocket. We're stitching from this folded edge all the way around, stopping and leaving that gap, coming down here and stitching up this side. So I'll be doing this part now in the blue, and you can do yours either in 2 parts, or maybe you just need one thread and you can do it all together. See you in a minute. All right, we're back with our stitched bag. We do have an opening right here to turn, and you'll notice that I have pressed the seam allowance on both sides towards the inside of the bag, so that later when we go to close that up, it's already been pressed down. So we have to make our box corners now. And what we're going to do is in all 4 corners, following this same procedure, we're going to be marking 1.5 inches in. So I'm using this little tool, but you can measure out a little square and place it down here. We just want to be 1.5 inches from the folded edge and 1.5 inches from that stitched line. So if you aren't careful, you might forget about that seam allowance and have the wrong size square here. So I'm 1.5 inches from the folded edge and 1.5 inches from my seamed line right here. And I'm going to do that on all 4 corners. Now over here, I've got two seamed edges that I'm lining up. So I have 1.5 inches here from this seamed edge and 1.5 inches from that seamed edge. And I'm going to just draw that with my disappearing pen. Now I'll do that to all 4 corners. Again, this is a folded edge and this is the seamed edge, my stitching line. A little harder to mark on the fiber fill, but it still works. 1.5 inches from the stitched line here and 1.5 inches from the stitched line here. And we're going to cut those corners out. All right, our four corners have been removed, and we're going to go to our ironing board and try to press both of these end pieces open. Will help us line things up a little bit and give a hard press to that fold so that we will know where the folded line is. All right, we are ready to box our corners. To do that, you need to get your hand inside of the bag and turn it so that the seamed edges come together. And we want to then make sure that these lines are straight that we've just cut out. We'll pin all four corners together like this. To be a little bit careful because you didn't back stitch here because, well, you might have at the end, but it's not back stitched here because it's we've cut that seam, so just be careful. And now we're going to be matching up on the opposite side our seam line with the fold line that I had you kind of finger press in there so that you'll know where to match it up. Okay, so do all four corners like this. Okay, all four corners are pinned. We're going to go to the machine and we're going to stitch a 3/8 inch seam allowance along all four of those corners. All right, we're back with 4 boxed corners, and I am going to trim on the lining piece this seam allowance down pretty far. Because of the fiber fill, I want it to not be too much in the way when I turn the bag, and that's what we're going to do next. We're going to turn the bag. So you'll just put your hand inside of that opening that we left and go for the main part of the bag and gently push and pull it through and get all of the lining pulled through as well. We want to take our fingers and poke them down in these corners to press them out on the main part of the bag, and do the same on the lining. And now we should check your bag over, make sure there's nothing you've forgotten to do. Now would be a good time before we stitch this up to, if there was a mistake, to fix it. But at this point, we're going to straighten this seam up. It'll help you get in there and do your stitching, and just pin this closed. And I'm going to stitch from the entire length of the opening plus a few stitches on either end and back stitch at both places. Come back and press the lining and press the bag. I've pressed my bag, and now I'm going to grab hold of the casings on either side of the bag and pull it apart, and we will push the lining part down into the bag, pressing out all the corners. And then I'm going to give it another press. I'm going to probably put my sleep board in here and press this side down, and the same thing on the other side to get this folded line pressed out. And then we will come back and make a self fabric pull tie for the bag. If you want to do a self fabric tie for your bag, you can. It will not work out of the fat quarters unless you're doing some piecing, but this is the least expensive if you have the fabric. You want to cut a piece not on the bias. You want to have it on the either direction, straight grain, 2 inches wide and about 35-36 inches long, depending how long you want the tie to be. Should you want to actually tie a bow, maybe a little bit longer. But what we're going to do is take our fabric and turn it right sides together, lining up these raw edges here, and press. Press it with your iron. Okay, so I have pressed this right sides together, and you're going to need a piece of heavy cord or well, a light cord, heavy string, or a little piece of ribbon. I've got an 1/8 inch piece of ribbon here that I'm going to use. And we're going to have it extend out the end of this little fabric envelope and have it really close to the fold. And I'm going to stitch across the end here, making sure that I've caught that piece of ribbon quite a few times, because I'm going to be pulling on it to turn this cord. And then so after stitching across this way, then I'm going to sew it so that from this folded edge, I have between 3/8 and 1/2 inch, depends on how thin you want it. And I'm going to be sewing that distance here, making sure to keep the ribbon pulled towards the fold as I'm sewing. You don't want to catch that ribbon while we're sewing. So let's go and do that. So we've sewn this seam allowance, not seam allowance, sorry. We've sewn a seam right along here, and we are now going to use our scissors to trim that seam very close to the edge, about 1/8 of an inch away. We want to have a very small seam allowance inside of our fabric tube. So let's cut that. Okay, I've cut that down so we have a very small seam allowance, and we are now going to hold on to the end that we sewed the ribbon to, and we're going to go to the other end where we have pulled the ribbon, and we're going to get a little bit of fabric worked up towards this. This is the toughest part of turning, is right here where we're first trying to get that end to go in. So if you want to trim that a little bit away, you can, and we'll just kind of work at it until we get it started to pull inside. So I'm going to work at that for a minute. Sometimes a knitting needle poke down in there, or if you're very careful, the tips of your scissors, just to get it started going on the inside. There. Now I've gotten it started, pushed towards the inside. So now we really can work some of the fabric towards the top so you can have your ribbon a little closer, and then hold on and start pulling. Don't try to do too much at a time so that you get it bunched up inside there. Once you get closer to the end, it's pretty fast to pull it through. Okay, so we've pulled it, turned it all the way inside out, and we want to come back to the beginning part where that ribbon is attached and just snip it off. Now you have your ribbon back, less a little bit that you cut off, and I'm going to trim both ends and go and press it again. Now that you've pressed it flat, you can use a tool like a knitting needle to push in the ends, and then we're going to sew a little seam across the end. You could, if you don't want to turn it in, you could just tie a knot at the end and let that fray out a little bit. That's entirely up to you. So I will get these ends turned in and sewn down, and we will come back and talk about threading the drawstring through that casing. I hope that you have a finished drawstring project bag that you're very happy with. This is a finished bag with the detachable handle and cute little kitty pocket inside there, and a different kind of cording that I've used here. This is not my choice of cording. I need some black grosgrain ribbon for my cording, but I don't have any at home, so I just found something that had a similar color to put in there. But I hope you enjoy your project bag. Remember, right down below are the cutting sizes and a list of the supplies and materials and tools that you will need to make this bag. I did want to tell you that if you make a bag, please post it on, if you do Instagram, post it on Instagram, and I'll put the hashtag down here. Off the top of my head, I think it's In a Pickle Project Bags, but I'll put it for sure down here for you. We are also over in my Ravelry group we will have a make along, sew along for this project bag. I'm going to title it Drawstring Project Bag, and the prize for that will be either this bag or this one, and I will let the winner choose which one they would like to have. I'm going to have that run for a couple of months, and something else I wanted to tell you about that. I wanted to tell you about this particular fabric. Sometimes I'll get questions about fabrics. This fabric in particular, this is a fabric that you cannot make a bag and sell it. So that's why these are going to be giveaways in some of my make-alongs this year, and this one or the other for the make-along, the project bag make-along, Drawstring Project Bag make-along. This fabric I purchased from Little Skein in the Big Wool, and she designs her own fabric, has it commissioned and an artist designs it, but you can purchase it. So I purchased 1 fat quarter, and from that fat quarter I got 2 bags. And I had to be creative, so my handle, the only thing I cut from the fat quarter were these casings and the 2 main pieces of the fabric. So I can use these for giveaways, but I couldn't use my main color for the pockets. That was fine. I found a fabric that went okay with it, and I did use a canvas that I got at Joann's, and again I used that blue on the inside. But if you purchase this, they're not as inexpensive as lots of fat quarters are, but it is a lovely fabric, and I thought it made a cute knitting bag. But just be aware, this, if you are making project bags to sell, this is not a fabric that you can use on a sold project. But of course, gifts and things for yourself you could use it for. My other fabrics were all purchased from, I'm just looking here, my local quilt shop, except for this one, and this is a spoonflower fabric. It is a twill, and I don't recall the name, but it was something to do, if you just search hydrangea, I think you'll come up with that. So, and put the main color, I usually like the main color on the pocket. So those fabrics are all quilt store fat quarters. So I hope you made a nice project bag. I hope you're happy with your product, and have fun sewing. Bye-bye.